Okay, so welcome back, everybody. We're going to start building our application, and this is the point in time where we will actually begin creating the code for the application. So the first thing that you need to do is clear the app component TS, or just have the same code as I do. And for HTML as well, you need to clear it and then type in the same code that I have. Of course, the code will be available. You will be able to find it either under the lecture or just follow up the links in the introduction video. But I do believe that all of them will be under the lecture, so you don't have anything to worry about. Or you can type them as we go. If you want to type them as we go, just delete everything for the time being, the entirety of the code, and we'll proceed to writing it together. So we have the same files here as we had before, but what we're going to do is add another one. So we're just going to go ahead and say new file, and then we're going to type in account.model.ts. Did I type that right? Yes. That's all that we need to do. I'll explain in a moment why we're doing that, but I am going to copy paste the code primarily because I want to actually be explaining, and explaining and typing is not always the best of ideas, but you yourselves should really type the code in and not copy paste it. This is not complicated to type in at all. So in our application, we're going to have a list of accounts. So that is why we are making our own custom type account, which is basically a class similar to our interface user that we made in the previous tutorials. So since we're going to use this same type account over and over again across different files and export it across different files, basically, we should export it and we should basically separate it in a completely different file so that we have it there and we can reuse it on end elsewhere, so that we don't have to repeat the code over and over again for everywhere else where we might need this custom type. So we're going to create it here. We're going to create it in a separate file. The file will be called account.model.ts, and then we are going to recycle this code elsewhere. That is the logic that I'm following here. Okay, so every account is going to have an ID. This ID needs to be unique. Two accounts cannot have the same ID. So each account will have its own ID. This ID will be some number. So it's going to be a number. I don't know, the first account is going to have 1, the 10 billionth account is going to have 10 billion, etc. And this ID will be of type number. Also, every account will have a title. The title will be something, I don't know, we can type in the first, last name or something like that. But in any case, every account will have a title. So we create a variable title of type string. Down below, every account is going to have a description as well, so that needs to be a string as well, right? And the balance. So every account is going to need to have a balance, which will determine how much money does every account have. And all these are public because we're going to be using them extensively elsewhere, so we've placed them into public, really. And in such a way, we're going to be able to recycle them as much as we want. And of course, export class is very important because, as I said, we want to be able to use this elsewhere. Now, down below, we have a constructor. Now, what is a constructor? Constructor is a special type of a method which will be used to create an object of this type. We basically, the syntax is pretty much the same as for a method, if not the same. In my eyes, it's the same. So you type in public, constructors should be public, and then you type in constructor, ID, and then the type number, title, and then the type string, description, type string, balance, type number. And these will be used to set the properties of these values, to set the values of these properties. Often, constructors can have additional logic other than sheer initialization. You can do in them pretty much everything you can do inside of methods as well. And its goal is to set the values of properties, to set the proper values. So how does this function? Well, this constructor will be called somewhere in the code, not in this model. It will be called elsewhere in the code. So each time this constructor is called, a different instance of this class will be created. And since in each instance the values are pretty much should be different anyway. They can be the same, but each instance will have its own variables. Properties will have these properties. And for each instance, these properties values can be different. So when this constructor is called, these arguments are passed to it, and then these arguments are used for initialization. And we're stating this dot ID is equal to this one. So we pass ID to constructor, and then that ID is used to initialize an ID here. And over again, the values are not, the properties are not being overwritten each time a new one is created for every instance of the class. And that is how we basically initialize them. So once again, you pass an ID here, and then that ID is used, so this and this corresponds, and then that ID is used to initialize the ID of the current instance of the class. So basically you're going to have more than one account. You're going to have like 10, 15 accounts, and each one of those 10, 15 accounts is going to need to have an ID, a title, a description, and a balance. And each one of those accounts is going to be a different instance of the class. So therefore we need to initialize these values every time a new account is created, or every time a new instance of this class is created. Okay, so we've created our account.model.ts. We're going to go ahead and continue in the follow-up tutorial.